There was a rustling of dead leaves on cold stone. Mom walked slowly but steadily along the highest edge of a large rock boulder that loomed up out of the mossy ground like the prow of a small ship. She had seen it through the trees from some distance away, and had made for it swiftly, hoping to gain a more commanding view from the top of its height. The forest had thinned somewhat as she drew near to it. Some fallen trees still covered the ground around her, but the range of sight was certainly clearer, as she had hoped. Behind the boulder upon which she climbed, there were other such natural edifices, and some of the stone structures amassed themselves into very large and decisive features of the landscape. She seemed to be approaching the outer reaches of a mountain ridge, but from a strange and unexplored angle. She had reached the base of the foremost ridge and climbed it quickly. Now she stood upon its outjutting apex, and she was indeed rewarded with a sweeping view. She could see the flowing land littered with decaying foliage, and beyond it, the black lines of trees again. Their tops spread out to the horizon like a rough plateau, almost on a level with the height of her position. Behind her, and to her far right, the features of the mountains became definite. They loomed up huge and dark, retreating up into the obscurity of the cold, foggy sky. A faint sound of running water, as of some rivulet of melting snow, greeted her ears. But though she scanned all this territory with an intent and searching glance, no sign of any living being, friend or foe, met her disappointed gaze. The land and forest before her was clearly deserted, and she knew with some certainty that none of her missing stone walls would have dared to explore the foreboding mountain pass under the present circumstances. She looked down, still determined in spite of her dashed hopes, and took the first careful step to begin her descent. At that moment, along with a sudden noise of pebbles grating upon rock, she heard 2 distinct footfalls behind her. With a sudden smile, she turned round quickly to greet, as she hoped, one of her prodigals. Yet as she turned, the smile vanished. A wary apprehension appeared in her eyes. The figure who stood before her was nothing the like of which she had ever seen before. "Who are you?" she asked. "Oh, Hank, where do you suppose Rose could have gotten off to?" asked Carrie exasperatedly as she slumped down beside him on an old fallen log. "I don't know," grumbled Hank, "and I can't see how she could have gotten so far away before it occurred to me to turn around and see that she was missing. But I figure that whatever mess she's in, it's her own fault for wandering off again without telling us." "Oh, Hank, how can you be so heartless?" reproved Carrie. "You know she wouldn't wander off on purpose. She must be scared stiff, poor thing." "Well, that's her own fault, too," said Hank, getting up and pacing restlessly over the wet ground. "If she wasn't such a chicken, we wouldn't have to worry like this. Stonewall, indeed. If she remembers the old name so stubbornly, then why doesn't she still act like one?" "Well, come on," said Carrie, getting up with a sigh. "We should get back to looking for her." They started off again, weaving their way through the trees and hollering for Rose. Hank had long ago resumed his method of landmarking, and though he was not yet barefoot again, the peculiar treasures of his well-stocked pockets were fast dissipating. "Silly old Rose," he muttered, as he reluctantly laid his pocket-knife on a gnarled tree stump. "I suppose I shouldn't be so hard on her, but I can tell you that I'll be good and riled if I come back and find that some critter or something has wandered off with my new knife." "Hank, do you hear something?" asked Carrie suddenly, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him to a stop. "It sounds like drums or something." Hank halted and listened. "No, that isn't drums," he murmured. "Sounds more like the galloping horses in an old western." He fell silent then, for the noise was coming towards them at an alarming rate. It was unmistakable now that it was the thundering of horse hoofs, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. Neither of the children had ever heard such a sound in real life, and even Hank glanced about nervously. "Say, they're coming near," he said. "Let's get up that way, quick." He took Carrie's hand and pulled her after him. They had been standing in a little valley of the forest land, and on one side of them the ground rose in a steep hill. They scrambled quickly up the slope, making use of the trees that grew upon it to pull themselves up, for the steep ground was muddy and the moss was slick. The sound of the hooves rang through the trees about them, and it was difficult to judge where the intruders might appear or how soon they might be upon them. "I hear voices," breathed Carrie, as they gained the top of the ridge together and paused to catch their breath. "Should we run?" "No, we don't know who it is," Hank panted. "Let's hide up here, and don't worry, Carrie, there's no reason to be scared." Carrie glanced up at him and hid a smile. "You forgot your pocket-knife down there," she observed. Hank glanced down at the stump where his knife lay, suddenly crestfallen. "Drat! Well, I guess it's too late to get it now." "There! Someone's coming! I can see them!" gasped Carrie, peering through the trees in nervous excitement. "Oh, my goodness! Hank, look!" Hank turned quickly as she pointed, and his countenance grew quite amazed as the astonished exclamation broke from her lips. Two figures on horseback had just come into view below them. They were down on the floor of the little valley, cantering towards the very spot where Hank and Carrie had stood only a few moments before. The two children had a lofty view from their height, and they were utterly hidden by the sheltering trees at the top of the ridge, yet even so, they huddled together behind the nearest trunk as if by common instinct. With the sights that now met their eyes, it was small wonder that they felt themselves grow timid. "Sire, stay! Thy pardon grant!" came a sudden cry. One of the riders had pulled up and spoken. His horse was several yards in front of the other, and at last, as they swept up before them, Hank and Carrie were granted a clear view of the strangers. Carrie caught her breath aloud. Hank rubbed his eyes and looked again, wondering if they could be playing tricks on him. The horse of the one who had spoken was a tall and mighty steed, just as one might imagine a war horse of long ago. It seemed the rider was a young man, and Hank wondered if he could even be very much older than Luke or Jim by the sound of his voice. If so, age would be all they had in common. Carrie thought to herself that if ever a character had stepped forth from the pages of a fairy tale, it was this youth. He wore a leather jerkin studded with clasps of steel, and the sleeves of his blouse were gathered at the wrists by thick bands of silver. His tall boots reached to his knees, and the shining spurs on his heels jingled as he rode. Upon his head was a cocked cap, and as they strained their eyes to see more closely, they saw a long, thin dagger slung at his belt. Yet even on the instant as they saw him, the second rider reined up, and all thoughts of this first fellow were driven from their minds. It seemed they had been struck dumb at the sight of the kitten, and not thought to look for the lion. The second horse was a great black beast, far larger than any they had ever seen. The man upon it was head and shoulders above the other rider, and the figure he cut gave warrant that he was one of singular importance. "Sire, what more can man say?" cried the smaller stranger, as the great black horse swept up alongside it. "Thou dost not—" His words were cut short, for suddenly the other made a quick motion, too quick for the children to see, and something happened. All at once the taller stranger was holding in his own hand the dagger that had been at the other's side, and then the smaller fellow was somehow flung down headlong from his steed. Carrie gasped. The horse leapt lithely aside, and the greater steed was sharply reined to a trembling halt by the quick hand of its master. "On thy feet, Flint!" That voice of ringing command echoed across the little valley. The very sound of it made Carrie give a start. Hank didn't move even so much as to blink, and he gazed down in wonder at the mounted man, whom the other had addressed as sire. They could see now that his garb was rich and fine, though cut after the manner of a horseman or a man of war rather than royalty. A scarlet cloak covered a mail hauberk. No crown was on his head, but a long sword was slung at his side, and its sheath was bound about with bands of silver. Something golden glinted at his throat, even in the dreary light. His hair was dark and fell free about his shoulders. His face was turned away from them. "On thy feet, prattling fool!" he commanded again. The unhorsed stranger rose quickly, returning the cocked cap to his bared head, and it seemed he was unhurt. "If ever man were rendered wroth of himself, 'tis I, of course, sire," he began at once, but suddenly halted as he met the other's eyes. All was still for an instant as the sire looked down from his lofty height. Then suddenly he swept his sword from its sheath. The young man took a step back. "Wilt thou slay me, my prince?" he asked. Carrie froze, for even though the unhorsed youth had spoken in low tones, the words met their ears with terrible distinction. The prince turned his steed to follow the retreating steps of his companion, and at last his face was revealed. It seemed, to their great surprise, that this frightening figure was but himself a young man. As they watched, he raised his sword aloft, as though to answer the question with the terrible act itself. Carrie shut her eyes, and Hank held his breath. "Nay, I shan't slay thee today," came the sudden reply, and Carrie quickly opened her eyes again. "Yet learn, Flint, to give no orders to thy servants without my bidding, for thou hast spoilt a good hunt this day. On thy steed now, return to the fortress and to thy duties." He finished his command by dealing the other a ringing blow across the face with his gloved hand, and even Hank winced at the sound. Then he lazily straightened up in the saddle and cast a disinterested eye about the little valley. For a moment he gazed up towards the clouded sky and sighed, as though he were weary of the gloomy sight. Carrie and Hank wondered greatly at him, for his manner was disarmingly unmoved, and it seemed his violent words had not served to excite him in the least. The fellow called Flint had rubbed a hand across his face and turned away to gather the reins of his straying steed. He, for his part, only deepened their surprise, for he also appeared very little shaken by such a near escape. As his sallow face was turned almost directly towards them, Carrie saw a haughty carelessness upon it, though he had cowered but a moment before, and her sympathies were quickly altered. It seemed there was quite as wicked a visage about this mistreated servant as there was upon his fearsome sovereign. "I go to take counsel in the Ring of Fates," said the prince, as he set his sword back into its scabbard with a ringing clang. "Tarry not on thy way back to Sleaholk, else I shall give thee true reason to rue this day." "Stay, my prince!" exclaimed Flint, as he suddenly stopped beside his horse and stooped down to the near stump. "Here lieth a strange token. I know the sight of it not, from all the gear of thy armies." He held aloft Hank's pocket-knife, and the prince turned for an instant and glanced darkly down upon it. "Neither do I know it," he said, and turned away with a careless wave of his hand. "Yet it seems of little importance. Take thy token and be on thy way, ere the sound of thy voice begins to weary me once more. I shall return before sundown." He spurred his horse with a sudden vengeance, and the beast reared majestically, neighing so that the trees shook, and broke into a gallop as its hoofs met the earth once more. Hank and Carrie watched in awe as the mighty figure thundered away and vanished from their sight at the far end of the valley. Then they returned their gaze to the other as he mounted his own steed and started off at an easy pace, disappearing into the farther reaches of rambling woods. The echo of hooves hung in the silence for several moments, and then even they faded into the heavy stillness. Hank glanced at Carrie, and she met his gaze. It seemed neither wished to be the first to speak. At last Hank swallowed. "That fellow took my pocket-knife." Carrie nodded soberly, but said nothing. Suddenly Hank looked about wildly, as though coming to his senses. "We've got to find Rose!" he cried. "Come on!" nodded Carrie, almost before his words were spoken. She took the hand he offered, as with one accord they dashed off through the trees. Rose stood very still. She had scarcely moved since the moment when first she had halted in the wide-open clearing. Now at last she turned her head and gazed round at the strange place. The clearing seemed utterly separated from the unkempt woodlands all around it. It appeared as premeditated as the wood was wild. It was almost perfectly round, about 20 feet broad the whole way. There was something quite ritualistic and pagan in its appearance. Very slowly Rose walked toward the strange mound. A strong curiosity had overpowered her fear, yet despite her moment's courage there was something in the depths of her heart that foreboded approaching danger. The clearing was so unlike the other parts of the forest that she felt utterly separated not only from the previous landscape, but also from even the experiences of her past. The very memory of Hank and Carrie and all the rest seemed driven from her mind. Something new and strange was here, and very little of her old life seemed pertinent at present. "Hello?" she called softly, and she realized, even as she spoke, that she was no longer calling for her own companions. As it had before in this strange world, her wobbly voice hung in the air before her like a mockery of her cowardice. She glanced quickly round, along the bounds of the clearing, waiting for an answer to her call. She looked down at her feet. The ground in the clearing was only covered by low-cropped turf, and she found that her shoes were caked with dark mud, and several dead leaves were sticking to them. Just as she was standing still, gazing down at the ground, she felt a hot wind brush past her cheek. It bore the feeling of a foul-smelling breath, as though someone had silently come up behind her, and the feeling filled her with dread. There was more within that dread than the fear that danger had surprised her from behind. She turned quickly and looked over her shoulder. There was no one behind her. Every detail of grass and trees in the clearing looked the same. Her frightened eyes darted to and fro for an instant, for she felt certain that something had made its presence felt, with the rumor of that hot breeze. Slowly she turned back around to face the mound. At once she caught her breath. She was no longer alone.